안녕하세요. 자본시장연구원의 박혜진입니다. 이번 KCMI 글로벌 이슈에서는 전환금융의 의미와 역할을 주제로 인터뷰를 진행하겠습니다. 먼저 오늘 주제에 대해 말씀해 주실 엘리아 트리펠 연구원님을 소개드리겠습니다. 엘리아 트리펠님은 OECD의 그린 파이낸스 앤 인베스트먼트 팀에서 정책 분석가로 근무하고 계십니다. OECD에 합류하기 이전에는 유럽위원회에서 EU 지속가능금융 액션 플랜 및 녹색 분류체계 개발 작업에 참여하였습니다. 코로나19 기간에는 EU 경제회복기금의 녹색 관련 투자를 지원하는 역할을 담당하였으며 현재 녹색 분류체계 및 지속가능금융 관련 주제에 관해 활발히 연구 중에 계십니다. 또한 지난해에는 전환금융에 대한 OECD 가이드라인의 주 저자로 참여하였고 이 보고서는 앞으로 녹색 금융을 추진하려는 정책 입안자 및 시장 참여자들에게 중요한 참고 자료가 될 것으로 기대됩니다. 그럼 전환금융의 의미와 역할을 주제로 엘리아 트리펠 연구원님과 인터뷰를 시작하겠습니다. 첫 번째 질문입니다. 최근 녹색 금융, 지속가능 금융과 함께 전환금융이라는 개념이 언급되고 있습니다. 전환금융의 개념은 무엇인지, 그리고 기존의 녹색금융, 지속가능금융과의 차이점은 무엇인지, 왜 전환금융이 중요한지 말씀 부탁드립니다.
It's clear that to transition the global economy to a 1.5-degree world, a lot more investments into zero emission solutions are needed, while investments in high emission assets and infrastructures have to be phased out. And so green and sustainable finance has grown very significantly in the last years in order to help shift the focus of financial institutions and investors towards investment into clean technologies like renewable energy. But as this has been happening, it has become clear that existing tools within green and sustainable finance are not sufficient in order to fully enable a global whole of economy transition, especially when it comes to emerging markets and developing economies and sectors that are very high emitting today, all of which need to get onto net zero trajectories. That doesn't mean that green and sustainable finance tools are not absolutely indispensable in order to do that. It just means that there are some complementary tools that need to be developed within that broader ecosystem in order to support the transition of all sectors, including high emitting sectors. And it's in that context that the concept of transition finance has been developed and has rapidly gained traction over the last couple of years. Again, I would say that transition finance is just a part of broader sustainable finance, but it refers to very specific tools within that general toolbox to enable the net zero transition. And so in the last couple of years, there's been a proliferation of different transition finance initiatives by governments, but also by market actors and by industry. And despite there being such a growth in different approaches, there isn't yet a commonly agreed set of criteria or definition for transition finance or transition activities, but there is agreement on some of the core concepts. And specifically, actors agree that transition finance is generally intended to decarbonize economic activities that today are emissions intensive and that don't have a fully viable green substitute yet, but that can be brought onto a pathway to net zero. And so with that in mind, transition finance can be quite inclusive of different sectors and geographies. But of course, this level of inclusiveness increases the risk of greenwashing. And that prevents some market actors from fully engaging in transition finance and from scaling up the transition finance market. So to reduce this greenwashing risk and to give credibility to transition finance transactions, the OECD published last year in October an OECD guidance on transition finance, which recommends that transition finance transactions should be anchored in credible company-wide transition plans. in order to give credibility to those transition finance instruments and to make sure that greenwashing is minimized and they have environmental integrity. And so to do that, the guidance sets out 10 key elements of credible corporate climate transition plans, which can form the basis of transition finance transactions. And these elements are based on some of the existing approaches that are out there, but there are also some additional elements that we introduced that we think can increase environmental integrity. So for example, of course, there needs to be a credible net zero target and interim targets, and the use of scenarios in order to show how the company can reach the target. We also introduced some aspects relating to carbon intensive lock-in and safeguards that companies need to put in place in order to prevent carbon intensive lock-in. There needs to be transparency on how offsets are used. There needs to be reporting on different emission scopes, including scope 3 emissions and so on. But of course, the guidance also recognizes that there is some flexibility that is needed for small and medium-sized companies, and also certain companies that operate in markets where there is a lack of an enabling environment and not a sufficient policy framework. So for example, a company, a cement company that operates in a country that doesn't have a net zero target and doesn't have policies supporting that net zero target might not be able to have a decarbonization target of 2040. They may need to have a target that's a bit later than that because they don't have the supporting environment from the jurisdiction that they operate in.
답변 감사드립니다. 중간에 전환금융에 대한 OECD 가이드라인에 대해 언급하셨는데요. 이 보고서의 주요 내용과 목적에 대해 좀 더 설명해 주시겠습니까?
And so, as I mentioned earlier, the OECD published an OECD guidance on transition finance in October 2022. And as you can see on the slide here, the aim of the guidance was to provide a kind of landscape analysis of all the different types of transition finance approaches that are out there today, with a specific focus on transition plans. We also carried out a industry survey where we surveyed financial market participants, non-financial corporates, academia, civil society, NGOs, on what they perceive to be the key challenges in transition finance. So those are described as well in the guidance. And on the basis of this analysis, we concluded that the key element to ensure that transition finance is credible and to prevent greenwashing in transition finance is to have a credible corporate climate transition plan to which the financial instrument is linked, as I mentioned earlier. And to help develop these credible transition plans, in our guidance, we set out 10 elements of what a credible corporate transition plan needs to have. And the audience of that is really both the market, but also policymakers, because the way in which these elements are set out, we think it can help financial market participants understand what they need to look for when they're trying to put forward a credible transition investment and they're trying to identify a corporate with a credible transition strategy. At the same time, we think that it can help corporates develop credible transition plans because it can give them an indication of what they need to be including in a plan to the best of their abilities, of course. And lastly, we think it can be useful to policymakers and regulators who are considering developing policy frameworks on transition planning in order to help them narrow down what types of elements they should be including in any possible legal or regulatory obligations.
답변 감사드립니다. 다음 질문으로 넘어가겠습니다. 일각에서는 저탄소 전환 과정에서 녹색 산업에 필요한 기술과 인력이 선진국가 부유층에 집중되면서 경제적 불평등이 확대될 수 있다는 우려를 표명하고 있습니다. 그리고 이와 동시에 그린워싱에 대한 우려도 지속적으로 제기되고 있습니다. 전환금융을 추진하는 데 있어서 장애물은 무엇이며 극복해야 할 과제는 무엇인지 말씀 부탁드립니다.
One of the key challenges to scaling up the transition finance market is what I already mentioned in previous answer, is really the risk of carbon lock-in, which means that different market actors are hesitant to engage in transition finance transactions because of the greenwashing that they may be accused of if they engage in transition finance transactions. And this is really against the background of IPCC conclusions, which show that the further installation of unabated fossil fuel infrastructure will lock in GHG emissions. And because of these conclusions, there is continued debate today around whether and which fossil fuel investments are necessary for the net zero transition, especially in industry. The risk of carbon lock-in is quite high when it comes to assets and infrastructures that can use fossil fuels, but that can also use low carbon fuels like hydrogen, for example, but where there are only very limited safeguards to ensure that those assets and infrastructures actually use the low carbon fuel. And so in that case, there is a risk that there is a continued use, for example, of natural gas, which would lead to carbon lock-in. And the OECD guidance already requires that companies identify assets and infrastructures that are at risk of lock-in, and that companies specify mechanisms to prevent lock-in as part of credible transition plans and transition finance transactions. But there is still further work that needs to be done because there are limitations with regards to the safeguards and the mechanisms that are being used today. So we are actually currently working on a project to compare existing options and approaches, and also provide an analysis of their advantages and shortcomings, and offer additional insights into robust mechanisms that can prevent carbon lock-in and reduce greenwashing risk, but increase credibility. Another challenge is indeed the challenge of managing the just transition, and this just transition aspect is also one of the 10 key elements of credible corporate transition plans that we set out in the OECD guidance. And what we explain is that it is very important that companies consider how their transition will impact workers and suppliers, local communities, and consumers. And companies should take measures to mitigate negative impacts on workers, human rights, consumers, and local communities through, for example, reskilling. So when you have a company where a new type of technology is used as part of the decarbonization journey, that company should make sure that the workers that are working there today can be retrained and reskilled in order to work with these new technologies. And there are several instruments that can help companies manage just transition aspects. For example, the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, the OECD due diligence guidance for responsible business conduct, the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, and of course there are several ILO, International Labour Organization, instruments that can help with this as well. And there is ongoing research, for example, by the London School of Economics on this particular topic.
답변 감사드립니다. 다음 질문입니다. 최근 우크라이나 전쟁으로 인해 에너지 가격이 크게 오르면서 에너지 안보의 중요성이 강조되고 있습니다. 이와 관련해서 한국에서는 탄소 중립과 에너지 안보를 동시에 달성할 수 있는 대안으로 원자력 발전에 대한 논의가 활발히 이루어지고 있습니다. 우크라이나 전쟁이 향후 저탄소 전환에 어떤 영향을 미칠 것이라 생각하시는지, 이러한 위기에 한국은 어떻게 대응해야 할지 말씀 부탁드립니다.
The war in Ukraine has very clearly put unprecedented pressures on many governments to ensure energy security. And any measures that are related to fossil fuels should only be within the context of a very robust government net zero strategy and related policies around that, like industrial policy. So, for example, Germany argues that the coal-related measures they have put in place are still consistent with their overall coal phase-out target and strategy, because they are short-term and time-bound, and there are other steps that are being put in place in order to advance the phase-out strategy. But importantly, all countries should use this as an opportunity to heavily invest into renewables and into energy efficiency and into that entire supply chain, including upstream and downstream of renewables like wind, for example, so that they can help decrease dependence on fossil fuels, because these problems are going to continue recurring within other contexts and other types of crises. And similar measures have already been taken quite recently, for example, in Europe, as part of the economic recovery measures that were put in place to recover from the economic crisis that was caused by COVID. There were many climate-related reforms and investments that were included in the recovery plans of different countries, because it was recognized that this type of crisis needs to be used as an opportunity in order to build resilience and prevent similar or future crises from happening. It is undisputable that nuclear is a source of low carbon energy, but that there are doubts regarding long-term storage of radioactive waste. In the end, nuclear might be a good source of low carbon emissions electricity that can be used in conjunction with renewable energy if that's socially accepted by the country and by its population. What is true is that in most countries, there is still room to massively increase renewables investments. And given their price and the speed at which they can be developed compared with nuclear, which tends to be very expensive and lengthy, irrespective of whether one supports it or not, renewables should remain a priority because they can be much cheaper and much faster to develop. And transition finance can be very useful in this regard, and just more generally to achieve carbon neutrality in Korea and elsewhere, because it can help companies raise finance for their decarbonization journey in line with the Paris temperature target, as long as they have a credible strategy in place.
답변 감사드립니다. 그럼 다음 질문으로 넘어가겠습니다. 전환금융을 활성화하기 위해서는 민간과 공공부문의 협력이 매우 중요하다고 생각되는데요. 전환금융 시장을 활성화하고 경제의 저탄소 전환을 촉진하기 위해 한국 정부는 어떤 정책적 지원을 할 수 있을지 의견 부탁드립니다.
To scale up the transition finance market, several challenges need to be overcome, and specifically two types of challenges. One is the enabling environment that needs to be right, and the second is the greenwashing risks that still exist today and that need to be minimized. To reduce greenwashing, one key challenge in greenwashing that needs to be addressed is the risk of carbon lock-in. That is probably the biggest greenwashing risk that exists today in transition finance. And companies need to put in place mechanisms to reduce lock-in, and that needs to be outlined in their transition plans and matched by credible sustainability performance targets as part of any related financial instrument, like, for example, a sustainability-linked bond. So for a policymaker, it's very important that when policies on transition finance are made, that this risk of lock-in is considered and that safeguards are put in place in order to minimize lock-in. And the OECD guidance that we published last year already provides an overview of some existing safeguards. And the project that we are working on now, which is a report on mechanisms to prevent lock-in, which will be published later this year, will provide additional insights into what types of mechanisms policymakers and companies can use in order to prevent lock-in. The other challenge is, of course, to ensure that the enabling environment is right, and policymakers should ideally have very clear national sectoral net zero pathways in place to help companies develop credible transition and investment plans. And generally speaking, the policy framework should be such that financial market participants can assess the credibility of company transition plans to identify credible transition finance opportunities that they want to invest in, that they want to finance. This can be done through company disclosures. So there are different ways in which policymakers can put in place disclosure frameworks that require or encourage or incentivize companies to disclose their transition plans. And those policy frameworks could contain specific elements of what should be in a credible company transition plan. Ideally, this would also be matched with appropriate fiscal incentives, like carbon pricing, for example, to make sure that for companies, low carbon options are competitive and affordable. And of course, lastly, it needs to be matched with relevant industrial policy and related regulation to make sure that companies are actually incentivized to move towards cleaner options, so that those options are both competitive because of the carbon price, but that also there are regulatory incentives to help companies move towards cleaner options, which can be, for example, standards on emissions or energy performance, for example. But of course, it needs to be within a broader framework that can then also bring in financial market participants, which again is helped by disclosures, but also by very clear policy signals and incentives by the government to show companies where they need to get by 2050, like through technology, pathways, and roadmaps.
답변 감사드립니다. 마지막으로 한 가지만 더 질문드리겠습니다. 앞선 답변에서 전환금융이 활성화되기 위해서는 기업의 신뢰성 있는 전환계획이 뒷받침되어야 한다고 강조하셨는데요. 이러한 전환계획이 무엇을 의미하는지, 이러한 전환계획의 신뢰성을 확보하기 위한 핵심 요소는 무엇인지 좀 더 구체적인 설명 부탁드립니다.
So a transition plan is an action plan that is time-bound and very clearly sets out the transition strategy of a company and how the company intends to reach its net zero goals and targets, and how it intends to transform its business model, its operations, and its assets in order to put itself on a Paris-aligned pathway. We decided to focus on transition plans as the kind of key piece that can help prevent greenwashing in transition finance and scale up transition finance, because this type of long-term plan by a company can reduce or even avoid risks relating to carbon lock-in and also to delayed action, because companies need to put in place a kind of long-term strategy and plan over a longer time horizon, which leaves them less room to push the can down the road, kick the can down the road, basically. And even though increasingly more and more investors are looking for companies that have transition plans when they try to identify credible transition investments, it appears that there are only very few companies that are currently developing transition plans, and the existing plans are very limited and also inadequate. So you can see here, for example, out of all of the companies that report using the CDP reporting framework, which already, let's say, is a minority of companies, because those are companies that want to do additional climate disclosures, only a third of them have transition plans in place. And as I said, often the disclosure is limited and inadequate. So I'll just spend a couple more minutes talking about the key elements of credible transition plans. So this first slide sets out the first 5 out of the 10 that we set out. And obviously a very key element is that the company needs to set a temperature goal, a long-term goal, and of course interim goals. So they need to have a net zero target in place, and that net zero target should be consistent with a 1.5 degree reference scenario and cover all relevant GHG emissions. We do provide some flexibility for companies that operate in jurisdictions that have no net zero target at jurisdictional level, or that have very late targets, like let's say 2060 or 2070, where we say that if the company is not able to be in line with 1.5, they may also be in line with below 2, but then they have to explain why 1.5 was not possible. We put a lot of emphasis on additional tools that are used in order to justify targets and to explain how the company will reach the target. And here you can see some of the tools that we think are useful. Sectoral pathways, where they're available, are extremely useful. So emission pathways at sectoral level and at national level. So the company could explain, where they fall on that pathway, how they're in line with it. Where available, they can use technology roadmaps as well. There are some jurisdictions that have translated their emissions pathways into technology roadmaps, where they explain where they see the technology in that sector going in order to get to net zero. So consistency with that and explaining how that's taken into account is useful. Of course, if the jurisdiction has a taxonomy, that can also be a very useful tool to use in order, for example, to explain future capital expenditure and the types of research, development, and innovation investments that the company is planning to carry out in order to get to net zero. Connected to that, it's very important that there are very clear KPIs and metrics that can be used in order to measure the performance and the progress of the company. They should be measurable and externally verifiable. And we emphasize that Scope 3 emissions should be included to the extent possible. That is the growing consensus in the market. They're very important. Of course, the measurement is quite challenging. So in cases where a company is not able to provide Scope 3 emissions, or let's say not all Scope 3 emissions, they need to explain which Scope 3 emissions were included in their reporting, which were excluded, and obviously explain why some of them were excluded. There needs to be a justification to explain the omission. And obviously there are tools out there as well that can be used to help measure Scope 3 emissions. For example, the OECD due diligence guidance for responsible business conduct suggests using supply chain mapping, which can be really useful. It's very important that companies also are clear on whether or not they've used carbon offsets. Using carbon offsets increases the risk of greenwashing concerns. So a plan that uses a lot of offsets may be less credible than a plan that uses fewer offsets. So we recommend that the use of offsets is really limited and is carefully explained and should really only be used for residual emissions that can't otherwise be mitigated. And ideally, they should be in a separate inventory, so not part of the main GHG inventory. The plan should also include a implementation strategy, so very specific actions that are set out in order to help achieve the target that was set. And that links back to some of the previous tools that I've mentioned, like, for example, taxonomies, which can be helpful with that. Companies should also do an assessment of whether there is any risk of emission or carbon lock-in, and if there are any specific assets or infrastructures that they currently own or that they're planning to invest in that are particularly at risk. If yes, they need to explain what kind of safeguards they're putting in place in order to mitigate and reduce that risk. And of course, if relevant, they should set out any plans they have for the responsible retirement of high-emitting assets like coal plants, for example. That is the main section of the first 5 elements, which are kind of at the heart of a sound transition plan. On this last slide, you can see 5 additional elements that we think are very important and that help strengthen the credibility of the plan. So ideally, a company would also explain how they mitigate other types of adverse impacts beyond climate change mitigation and net zero targets, like, for example, other environmental objectives or social objectives, because there can be spillovers and there are, lots of different dependencies between different types of environmental and social objectives. So it's important to bear those in mind as well. And on that note, it's important that the company also sets out steps and measures that they take to mitigate negative impacts on workers, suppliers, or local communities. So they need to take that just transition angle into account, because, of course, support from the community around where the company operates is extremely important. And we know that public buy-in to climate policies and climate action is very important in order for that action to be fruitful and effective. And then the last three elements are more governance elements, which are also incredibly important to make sure that the plan is implemented correctly. So there should be some integration between the financial planning and the transition planning in order to have internal coherence as part of the broader corporate business and financial planning and reporting of the company, and to make sure it's not that the transition plan is not a side element, but that it really is part of the whole business strategy. The way in which the transition plan is designed and implemented should also make sure that there is regular monitoring and reporting, and there is a senior management oversight, and all important stakeholders are involved, just to make sure that the company is held accountable and that the plan can be successfully implemented. And then very lastly, the company should report on their progress on the targets. They should disclose whether they're on track to meet the target or not. If not, they should readjust targets and explain how they are going to make up for the possible gap. And where possible, plans should be verified by third parties. Not all companies will be able to do that due to the additional cost, but if possible, that should, of course, be done in order to make sure that the plan is sound. Thank you very much for your attention.
지금까지 엘리아 트리펠 연구원님과 함께 전환금융을 중심으로 다양한 주제에 대해 이야기를 나누어 보았습니다. 깊은 식견과 지식을 바탕으로 유익한 이야기를 전해주신 엘리아 트리펠 연구원님께 다시 한번 감사드립니다. 기후변화 대응을 위한 국제사회의 움직임이 가속화되고 있는 가운데 국내 산업 부분의 저탄소 전환이 앞으로 더욱 중요한 이슈가 될 것으로 예상됩니다. 이번 KCMI 글로벌 이슈가 이러한 흐름을 이해하고 이에 대한 대응 방안을 마련하는 데 도움이 되길 바랍니다. 지금까지 시청해 주셔서 감사합니다.